Yes.
Isn't she lovely? She's so helpful, isn't she?
You need to say thank you every time because she does amazing work.
We do. We've learned to thank our AI, Lee. Ian Gilbert reminded us.
Go on, guys, but thanks very much for having me. It was lovely to see you.
Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you so much as well for leading that. So as Julia said, we're going to move straight into the next event, this panel event with Lee. Lee, thank you very much for joining us. Our panelists today are going to be Sharon Cawley from Connexus, who's just been with us, Lucy Spencer, founder of Education Boutique, and Vanessa Leach, who is the managing director of Tute Education. Hi, Vanessa, how are you doing? So, without further ado, we can kick on to the next session. We will be here for the next hour or so, and as a brief introduction to Lee, because we want to get straight into the questions that Lee has provided us with today. Lee is the pioneer behind the idea that developed into the National Tutoring Programme, first calling for a national tutoring service in the April of last year. And you can find that white paper online. I'm sure Jack will post that in the chat just now. This gives us a little insight into both the respect that Lee has commanded over his long career in research and education, as well as Lee's foresight in spotting a gap in the use of tutors in this country. As a former chief executive of the Sutton Trust, founding trustee of the Education Endowment Foundation, current professor of social mobility at the University of Exeter, but more importantly to us, a past guest on the Qualified Tutor podcast. Lee will, as Julia said, be leading a discussion around what the next phase of the NTP cannot miss and who it must benefit the most. So welcome to Lee, welcome to our three panelists. Lee, if that's okay with you, I'm going to hand over to you now to begin this discussion.
Thank you very much, Ludo, and thank you, Julia, for organising this lovely festival. I've been really impressed with the presentation, and it looks so professional. That's not a backhanded compliment, by the way. I wasn't expecting that, but it looks amazing. So, and it's great to be part of this session. As you say, you know, when you propose things like a national tutoring, well, we called it. We didn't call it a national tutoring program. I think it was a national tutoring strategy. Anyway, it was a national tutoring program of sorts that we proposed. Often I've done a lot of these things, and often it doesn't get, no one hears you. It gets lost. It's sort of, but this was something that came at the right time. So as someone involved in education for many years, it was a joy at first to see this idea being captured and others then supporting that idea. We'll come to this. I think the problem with all these things is the devil's in the detail of the implementation and delivery, right? And but just so you all know, I mean, I think that idea of we knew from my years at the Education Endowment Foundation and various books I've done that tutoring, whether it's done one-to-one or small group, is one of arguably the most powerful approach in education. In terms, you know, some researchers argue that is the ultimate. You know, that we should gauge any achievement in education to the measure of one-to-one tutoring. That is the sort of goal. Of course, we still want full classroom teaching. So it was always one of those approaches that we knew worked really well, and there was lots of studies that backed it up. But there was an issue in terms of take up, and in my view, at the time before the pandemic happened, there wasn't enough national effort to try and think about how we improve the numbers of children that might be helped by tutoring. And there's famous studies that we did that showed that the middle classes effectively were investing, as I do, by the way, as a middle class dad now, you know, invest in private tutoring for those children. So it wasn't helping those that needed it the most, right? So what I wanted to do this session is explore, now that we're on the verge of the second phase of the National Tutoring Programme, I guess, how we can improve it. And it's great to be with three experts here on this. I can't wait to quiz you on this. So how we improve it, and I think particularly for me, there's how to improve for the poorest children that perhaps need this the most, who've suffered the most learning loss in the pandemic. We know that. So I want to ask, but I also think there's questions about sustainability. I think there's questions about how tutoring organisations work with schools effectively, and how we ensure quality of tutoring. Actually, that all these have been questions, because if you try and do something at a national scale, it's hard to maintain that quality. So with all that preamble, I guess what I'd like to start with, just to all three of you, what would you flag up as the main challenges for the second phase of National Tutoring Programme? What do you think is it'd be nice to hear what you actually think is the main challenge, and perhaps I could just start with Sharon first, and then Lucy and Vanessa. But what do you think is the main thing we need to think about for phase 2 of the NTP?
I've been involved with the NTP now since I very, very first heard of it. Obviously, we were very privileged to be one of the first 33 providers. I've got predicted text on my phone that comes up NTP because I use that expression so much. I could line up 10 head teachers in a playground now, and I bet 5 of them still don't understand what the NTP is. I still think we have an issue that schools and teachers, unless you're in the NTP club, they still don't understand it. And when you're working with professionals who don't understand it, they automatically hold their hands up and say, no, that's not what we want. We don't like to outsource. We don't like to use other people. We like to use our own staff. So there's a mistrust about the NTP based upon the fact they don't fully understand it. And I know that the NTP this year has done a great deal in terms of communication with teachers, and they've pushed the word that's out there. But I think Randstad have got, at this stage, a duty of care where their marketing is concerned, where their clear messages to get out there to head teachers and to schools what is actually involved in the NTP, because there's still not a lot of great understanding about what it actually is. So I think our first barrier, first and foremost, is banging the drum, getting the message out there and explaining it to head teachers how this can really impact and benefit the schools. The next problem that we had that I think needs addressing in phase 2 is how slow schools are to mobilise. They decide they want something, they decide they're going to go with the NTP, and we can be weeks and weeks and weeks trying to onboard schools because we can't get in touch with the deputy head teacher. They're not phoning us back. They're really busy. The onboarding process seems to take so long. So schools have been like an oil tanker turning. They know they want it. They think they know what they want, but they haven't got the time or the capacity to factor in what they actually need where tutoring's concerned. So in the first instance, there's 2 things I'd flag up. First and foremost is raising awareness of what the NTP actually is. And secondly, helping schools be quicker to mobilise when it comes to communicating with NTP partners, so that they don't leave us in the ether for 6 weeks and then come back to us and say, can we start next Wednesday?
We'll come back to you, Sharon, on some of these issues, because I recognise those challenges. I think one of the worries about I think Randstad, who are taking up this second phase, is that one of the reasons they won that bid was that it was essentially costed lower than some of the other bids. And I don't, to be honest, I don't know the details of that, but the worry is that we'll have to cut corners rather than add extra resource to promote, maybe. But I haven't heard from Randstad on that, so maybe it's unfair to judge that. But you know, that would be the concern, wouldn't it? But we'll come back to resource to you. But I think these are really good points. Lucy, do you want to come next? What would you say the real priorities for the second phase?
Yeah, so definitely echoing sort of Sharon in terms of, I think assumptions would be what I would sort of sum it up as, because I think there's so many assumptions in education, from schools to tutors assuming they know what we do, from tutors to schools thinking that they restrict them, and actually it's the curriculum, not the school, that's restricting in so many ways. So I think definitely challenging assumptions. I think making sure that there's very transparent, and that was obviously one of the things that I've been quite vocal about in the first phase of the NTP. I don't think that there was the transparency that gets rid of all those assumptions for all parties, you know, and I think that's key. You know, like with education, you know, you can't assume as a teacher or a tutor or an educator that you know what the child needs to do when they come into that class, because you don't know what's happened to them that morning, you know, and you don't know what's, you know, what side of the bed they got out of or whatever. And I think that's so important. So I think assumptions would be my first point. Inspiration, I think, would be the second. And a lot of that comes down to vocabulary, in my opinion. I really dislike the use of the word catch up. I really dislike it. As someone who was a little bit nervous about coming on here today, actually, to talk to you guys, I was sort of thinking about, you know, actually, that's a really important thing. Why was I nervous? It's because I knew that I was coming on and I had something to say and I wanted to make a point. And that's probably how those children that are from these disadvantaged families that we want to support and that we want to lift up and, you know, inspire, they've got things to say as well. And if we're currently obviously like sort of pigeonholing them with, and I know that with models and, you know, there's a baseline to get a point across, and I understand that. But I really, you know, I think we need to be thinking of how the tutoring is going to inspire our learners. And I think some of that inspiration comes from the fact that we get rid of the assumptions, that everyone's working together. And I think that leads quite nicely onto my last point, which is that educators, we're all educators. It's not schools and tutors. That, for me, if I could do one thing in my life to break that sort of invisible barrier, I did a sort of little LinkedIn post about it the other day. And I just think that we're educators, you know. So many people, when we think of teaching as a career ladder, or what it used to be as a ladder, it's not that anymore. You know, we educators can move on and off. It's more like a web, you know. They can, as an NQT, you start, you might then, you know, move off into tutoring for a bit. You might decide that for certain reasons you want to go and be an LSA. All of those people are educators. And I just think that, to me, the NTP, it's still, obviously it's a very important, crucially important thing that everyone has worked so hard on the first phase to do. But I think moving forward, we want to really align, not it being schools and tutoring, that we're educators. And I think that's the three things that I would say.
Fascinating, Lucy. I mean, you spoke very articulately about that, by the way. I think, you know, there's loads of issues that are buzzing around in my head on that. I mean, I think I totally agree with the points you're making about transparency. And when I talk to head teachers and deputy heads, I think there are some assumptions made. I think one of the issues, though, as you'll all be aware, is it's such a diverse sector, you know, if we're going to call it tutoring sector. And I think that's one of the dilemmas with all this, that there's some amazing organizations which I know, you know, the three of you are involved in, and that I respect, because when I hear you talk about education, I can tell you know what you're talking. You know, there is an expertise there. I think there's also huge, big commercial players in this area, and I know, I call them children, really, you know, students that are involved as tutors. And when you talk to them, and this is usually in an informal setting, you know, I say, oh, so how did you get on with that? You realize just how crude some of the tutoring can be. And so schools, I think, have a sort of assumption that they often think of that type, I think, rather than the more sophisticated educators that you're talking about. I want to come back to you on that, Lucy, because I suppose one of the questions comes back to scale. And I don't know, it'd be interesting your views on that, of, are there enough high quality, let's just call them educators, out there to deliver what the country needs at the moment? And if not, do we need to target more? I really like the idea of this sense of being educators. I mean, and to be honest, I've been on a journey on this, because I you know, when we did the Sutton Trust report on private tutoring all those years ago, you do think of it as a distinct sector that's separate to schools. But when you start understanding the sector more, you realize that many tutors were teachers, many tutors become teachers. It's a really, and I think there is a piece to be done around how we present tutoring. So, and then lastly, I think I really think, you know, you talked about children there, done with rather than done to. I always think, you know, it works so much better in education. One of the things that head teachers say to me, not all of them, is that they think that they know their children the best. So the assumption is that if a tutor just comes in, they won't have as much understanding of what the children actually need. We might come back to that, but that's one of the things I do hear a lot. But these are all really good points. Vanessa, I want to come to you next, and we might then circle back on some of the themes that have been brought up by all of you. But Vanessa, what's your view?
Oh, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'm not sure what else I can add. And some of what I'll say is probably answered in the scalability question, but I think definitely we need more capacity. And I think there's three things in there. More tuition partners, which I know is the plan, because the plan for next year is going to be an open access scheme rather than it being a bid as it was last year. We obviously need more teachers, which we've already discussed. And I think picking up as well, I'm not sure who said it, but on capacity within schools, I think part of the funding would be very well spent if it was given to a leader in the school to manage the tutoring, because on top of teachers' workload, we found that too, it's been a lot for them to take on, particularly with the operational challenges of the NTP. As Sharon said, it's taken a long time to get schools on board. They have to sign an MOU, they have to sign different documents. And as you know, even before we get to what would you like us to teach to your students. So I think those operational capacity issues need to be addressed. And I think picking up as well on the awareness that maybe the NTP need to do more about that, Randstad from September onwards. But I think also the media need to get behind it. There's been such negativity about it. You know, you look at Twitter, there's such negativity about the National Tutoring Programme. And actually it's organisations like us. I'm a former teacher. I'm doing this because the student is at the centre of everything that we do. I was a disadvantaged child myself. I want to make a difference. It's not a political thing for us. We want to help. So if the media also got behind this and start making it about government policy, then I think we'd have more chance of success next year and onwards.
Just a few questions on capacity, Let's just come back to you on that particular point, and how you work with schools. I mean, so I understand it. Is it always at the individual school level in phase one, or because I was thinking, you know, that most schools now are in mats. You know, they're in collective groups of schools. Would it not be better to sort of have a discussion at that level, so that there you can get, I know, 10 or 20 schools saying, there's one person here we can coordinate with. Maybe you'd always have to go down to school level, I guess, to find out what specific needs were. But I just did that happen at all, you know, in terms of how this was organised, or was it always individual schools?
It was mainly individual schools. We had experience with one academy trust, and you'd think that maybe made it better, but it didn't, because each individual school needed to sign the MOU as well, which caused an extra layer of bureaucracy, if you like. So it didn't really help it. And I think a head teacher who's on a panel with me next, I think they would have liked the autonomy themselves, perhaps to choose a tuition partner rather than the trust choosing it for them. Having said that, I think it has worked out well, because the trust chose different tuition partners and they've evaluated all of those at trust level, and then they'll move forward with the ones who they found suited their schools best next year.
Yes, I just wondered whether that was something that, you know, could happen going forward. You know, there's always logistical issues around how you try and do something at national level, and I think this is hugely ambitious, right? And yeah, we might come back to that in terms of sustainability, because my vision for and I call it a national tutoring service, right? And we thought of that word carefully, because it was we thought it might, at that time we thought it might involve university students volunteering, and the idea of giving back, you know, the service point, the word of service is a very different connotation to program, right? So that was one of the reasons why we chose that. Just in terms of, I'll come back to the others to draw out some general themes, but just on that capacity issue again, you know, so when we did that original white paper that Ludo got, I loved it called white paper. That gives it a very grand sound, but you know, we were thinking that how do you utilize, for example, university students? So we were thinking, and I'm still talking to universities about this, by the way, and if you think schools move slowly, there's nothing compared to university, I'll tell you that. But the idea was that as part of their curriculum, that the students would, you know, they would get essentially a tick in their university study for volunteering to be part of one of the tuition. Now, depending what model, I guess, would work for that. And there's all sorts of questions about, can you train university students to do it well enough as, for example, former teachers? But could you see things like, because again, I worry about the model at the moment, in that you know, inevitably you have to go to the big commercial players, and my fear there, and again, I'm happy to be challenged on this, is I suspect there's much more variation in quality of tutoring in the really big let's call them commercial players. But anyway, any thoughts about where we might get more tutors in the future, Vanessa, just before we come back to the others?
Well, for us, we only employ qualified teachers or contract qualified teachers. So I've no experience with university students, but the majority of our teachers are those who don't have a contract elsewhere. We've in fact surveyed them this week to find what the profile of our tutor is. So 50% of them don't have a contract elsewhere, and 45% of them are doing this to continue teaching, having left the classroom. And I think there was a figure a couple of years ago that 55,000 teachers had left the profession. I know that there are more going into it now. Who knows with COVID whether they think it's a more stable career choice than others. But also, I think there was a statistic that a third of all NQTs leave, or newly qualified teachers do leave within the first 5 years. Well, you know, I went into teaching, as I've said earlier, to make a difference. Most teachers do. If they leave because of the different issues in schools, that's not because they don't want to make a difference anymore. You know, they still want to make a difference. So that could be channeled into teaching. And there's clearly a lot of those out there.
Just coming back to Sharon and Lucy on this then, I mean, you know, I want to come back to targeting, by the way, because that's my obsession. How do we get it to the poorest pupils? Because one of my worries, again, and I don't know how, you might be able to tell me more on this. You know, my worry was that it would be the schools that were best positioned to capitalize from having extra tutoring that would be the ones that would benefit, and actually the schools that are most up against it in many ways wouldn't be able to maneuver quickly enough, you know, and the very children that we wanted to help would therefore be perhaps not picking up on this extra support. Let's go to that first, actually. Sharon, on that issue, I mean, you've obviously talked about how, and I totally understand that point about how we communicate what the tutoring offer is, but do you have views about how we can ensure, and this is tough, by the way, because all the education programs I've been involved in, it's always the middle classes. You never underestimate the middle classes, right? How do we make sure that, given all the problems we've discussed already, how this gets targeted at those children that we most want to help?
Well, I hear this a lot about how do we target the children who need it the most? How do we target the poorest and the most in need? The first thing I'd like to say is every child has been disadvantaged by this global pandemic. Okay, so I understand what's been said about the poorest and the most disadvantaged, but one of my starting points is there's nobody who wouldn't benefit from the NTP or tutoring, in my opinion, at the moment, because even your middle class families, children have completely disengaged. We've got kids who are nocturnal teenagers now because they can't get off their Xboxes. So everything that we knew before the pandemic has just gone up in the air. But how do we actually ensure that we are reaching these children? I don't think it's an issue of identification. I think the schools can identify really, really well who these cohorts of kids are, and they do it. They go away, they give the job to a head of department, they give them the remit, they give them the profile, and they come up with the group names. There's no two ways about it. I've had spreadsheets sent from school that read like a disadvantaged dream. You've got all the kids, they're ticking all the boxes for SEN, pupil premium, perfect. How do we then translate that into 15 hours when these children will not engage? So I don't necessarily think the issue is identifying them. I think the schools do really, really well on that. They're not there to take the mickey and And to fudge any figures, they know who they want to target and they identify them well. But there's a difference between targeting and reaching. How do we then reach them? One of the things that's been really good with the NTP is there is a wide range. So you can go down your providers. Now, like Vanessa, we only use qualified teachers. We do not use university graduates. We do not use tutors from overseas. But you know what? Having a range is a really, really good thing for schools to pick from. So actually, having a qualified primary school teacher or a university graduate, I've got my personal feelings on that. I'd go qualified teacher every inch of the way. And I think pulling university students down to do tutoring does send a bit of a shiver down my spine. I'll be fair with you there. I'm not happy, but I'll hold my counsel. But how do we reach them? We reach these children by stopping looking at them as cohorts. And we reach them by looking at them as individuals. And this is what I say every single time I speak to the schools. Do not choose one provider. Do not choose one thing that you want. Don't get on the phone to me and say, we've got a cohort of disadvantaged children after school, year 10. We want them doing 1 hour after school. No. You want some doing 1 hour after school because they'll love it. You want some doing it online first thing in the morning. You want some doing it remotely from home. You will reach your children if you stop looking at them as cohorts and you start looking at them as individuals and really profile that kid, what will work well with them. And I think that's the way that the schools have had the biggest impact. They look across and they go, well, 1 to 3, I'm not putting in with him because there's no, instead of going, well, they're 3 level 5s. So if you really start to dig deep behind the kids you are trying to target and reach, and you offer an incredibly bespoke package, even as a school, we've got those 5 children after school online, we've got those 3 children in school, give a rich variety of everything that tutoring has to offer, and you will see far, far better engagement. Move from a one-size-fits-all and move from what suits the SLT. We don't want to take them out of curriculum. Yeah, you might not want to, but what does the kid need? We don't really want to do it after school. We don't really want to do it online. Ask the kid. These are your options. We think that children are saturated with online fatigue. That made me laugh halfway through. Online fatigue. These children came home from school and went straight on an Xbox. There's so much we can do here. Best way to reach a disadvantaged kid, ask them what they want.
So, Sharon, thanks for that. I'll ask the other two. I mean, I would come back on you in terms of, my research shows that disadvantaged learners have lost more learning, if we can use that phrase, during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, they were already behind on average. So the reason I push on that is because I've been involved in education over many years, and so just giving extra money to the school system, in my view, doesn't solve those issues, right? Because
you're just bringing them all up at the same level instead of I get you.
But what I do like about what you're saying is the sort of personalized approach, in a way, which I think is very interesting to me, because that's, when I talk to schools about what works best in the classroom, it's all about, ideally, it's about effective personal feedback to find out where the children are, and so I think I totally, and it sounds like a great thing you're doing, but how do you challenge? Do you just challenge schools on some of those assumptions then? How does it work?
We spend a lot of time with our onboarding. So they come to us, and personally, we're a franchise model. So we have a head office, and then we have principal directors who sit regionally with teams of tutors. So we've got an infrastructure which can support this. So it's not just one head office. We've got many businesses working regionally. But what's great is you start to have these conversations, and sometimes it's about educating them at the grassroots level. So you'll speak to the Senko, they'll come with the list of what they've decided at SLT, and then you slowly unpick it and you'll say, well, does it have to all be face-to-face after school? Does it have to? Well, why don't you just do it for 15? And you slowly begin this conversation of enlightenment with them. Then they go back and go, there's this range. And where I've been really fair as well is I've said, don't just use us. Have a really good look at multiple partners, because there's such a range out there that's on offer. Find what's right for the child. And as soon as they realise they don't have to just be shoehorned into a one-size-fits-all, and they can offer a real enriched and bespoke tuition package through the NTP, they still can't get over how cheap it is, which is always a winner. They're like, really?
Yes, I do worry. We'll come back to sustainability, because my understanding is the government's assumption is that they will fund this for a few years, but then it will be essentially left to schools to fund. I want to come back to that.
I think there's like a phasing down of this.
Phasing down. Can I just, Lucy, can I just ask you something that came up from Sharon's comments there about choosing teachers? And I totally get that. And in the white paper, I'm going to call it now, we did sort of say that your best bet is to use a qualified teacher, right? You'll still see variation in effectiveness, but you won't see quite as wide as if you get someone who hasn't taught in a class. And remember, one-to-one or group is a very different skill to whole class teaching, so we have to be careful of our assumptions there. But if we are going to have a genuine national program, are we going to have to go beyond qualified teachers to use other models? What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And actually, I've come on a bit of a journey with it myself, to be honest with you. I'm a qualified teacher. When I started Education Boutique 5 years ago, we were only qualified teachers. But linking back to something that you said, Lee, head teachers thinking that they know the best, the children. And I agree with Sharon that actually the identification of these children is not the issue. You can go to a head teacher and they're going to know, who it is that they think that they need the help with. So I totally think that, finding the scale of finding these teachers is key. And so for me, it comes down to not thinking about qualified teachers, but qualified thinkers, because to me, that's the difference between a teacher and a tutor, if I can really boil it down. Because teachers have to really go in and deliver a curriculum. They're like slightly bound to that, So they have, at the end of the day, they want the best for the children, but they've also got to make sure that the targets are hit in that national curriculum that we are still kind of bound to as I won't even go into where I am with the curriculum. But the thing with being a tutor is you are there, and it comes back to my inspiration and assumption kind of, tagline, if you like. It's about promoting thinking. So as an industry, if we are saying, well, unless you've done a PGCE or a BEd, you can't, you're not going to be as an effective tutor. How can we sit here and say that we can educate children and make them believe that they can do anything? So I do have to question, and that's genuinely like where I am now with it. When I hear people say, oh, it's only qualified teachers that should be tutors, I now disagree with that. And that's going against how I felt 5 years ago. And that's because I really, truly believe that if we are, as a tutoring industry, what we say we can do, and that we can inspire children and we can do the one-to-one, just because we're a tutor doesn't mean we're going to be more successful than a classroom teacher. It's still to do with the human person that's delivering and facilitating the child's thinking to develop. So for me, about finding the scale is about having key influential educators, not teachers, not tutors, educators, leading these initiatives and going, right, we now know that we need another 2,000 tutors in this area, or we need online tutors. Well, we need to get the best people at delivering high quality kind of training and thinking to these passionate people, because everyone wants to make a difference, right? So why should we as an industry say, oh no, those people can't get involved because they haven't yet got old enough maybe to do a degree? That's not okay to me. So I would have to question that, to be honest with you. That's where I stand with it.
And maybe, we could have different roles for those with different backgrounds. So
totally.
There might be different tutoring needs, as Sharon was talking about earlier, in the school, that maybe some of them are more conducive to having people that aren't necessarily qualified as teachers.
Absolutely. And I go back to when I was a teacher, my teaching assistant, I learned everything that I still hold really dear to my like educating ethos. I learned it all from her. And she was not a qualified teacher. She'd worked for 20 years as probably one of the most profoundly impacting sort of teaching assistants. She knew the children, everything was about them. It was all about, rather than someone leading them and saying, this, I assume that you need to do this, you must do this. It's all come from there. And I just think, I think it's quite limiting when we say that only, and I think that then leads on to those children, you know, us teaching professionals to educate in an open and a sort of like inspiring way. We need to have that same ethos when we're developing and getting people into this industry that's so important now.
Vanessa, can I bring you back in on some things that, again, this is all fascinating for me, by the way. I'm really enjoying talking to all you experts, as I don't often get to do this. You know, one of the themes here as well, I think, is catch up versus sort of creating independent learners, I guess. So you know, one of my views as an educationalist and as a parent, actually, who's used private tutors for my children, you know, is you know, the hope for me for teaching is, you know, is to create independent thinkers, what sort of Lucy's sort of phrase there. You know, what you want from a class, isn't it, is actually you're prompting and facilitating them to become independent learners, so they then can go out in the world and flourish, etc. And private tutors that do this really well, amazing, you know. But the counter to that is that it can create a sort of dependency culture among children, that they can only do stuff if they have someone extra support, you know, extra support them. And also in an NTP context, that it's focused on what we call catch up. And I know Sharon was challenging that term, but you know, I wonder what your sort of reflections are on that, because is there space to do both, I guess, would be the question in the NTP context.
Yeah, of course there is. I don't see it being it's either catch up, and Sharon, I agree, by the way, and I think the NTP themselves or the EEF certainly agree that catch up is not the word. Closing the gap is a better description, because that's what we're trying to do. But I don't think it's one or the other. If you get the pedagogy right in that lesson, be it, and you know, we use qualified teachers, but be it a qualified teacher or a tutor, if the pedagogy is right and you use metacognitive skills within those lessons with the children, then they will become independent learners. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. We are somewhat constrained, though, picking up on a few points on independent thinking and creativity and stuff by what the schools want us to deliver. So if the outcome from the school is we want the children to get from this point to that point, that's our job, because we're there to support the school. So not always can we go off track with students as much as we probably would like. I think the main frustration of some of our teachers is that they can't do that because they're an extra tool in the box for that school, rather than them having autonomy for that particular student's learning path. So that's somewhat of a frustration sometimes, but I think you can do both, definitely. And as I say, we employ qualified teachers, apart from in EAL or ESOL, where of course a TEFL qualification is something that we accept, and they do wonderful things with the children, but they go through our rigorous pedagogy training before they start teaching those children or teaching the children.
Yeah, it's really interesting you talk about closing the gap as well, because I've thought about gaps many years now, and the sad thing is, right, you know, I talk about the arms race in education. So whatever you do to try and level up the playing field, the middle class will find a way to sort of do more and more, and it's always difficult within the constraints of the education system broadly defined, with tutoring in that, to ever be able to close that gap. And I don't want to be defeatist about this, Vanessa, but I suppose I've always used just we want to improve progress or raise achievement for those. I mean, because I think you could close gap by reducing the grade, you know, and a lot of you get some bizarre, you know, in the education system, some bizarre sort of, you know, unintended consequences for those sorts of But anyway, I just say that it's almost a philosophical point.
No,
But,
yeah, I agree philosophically about that point, but with the NTP, its purpose is to address the gaps that caused by COVID. And I think we can do that with tutoring, particularly if you do address it at those disadvantaged children, which of course the pupil premium is the obvious way to do that. But I think there is a target, of course. I think 65%-ish of the NTP next year should be targeted at pupil premium. So that 35% is really important, I think, and that the schools use their own autonomy to choose who those disadvantaged learners are. Because you could have a student from a very poor background who has lots of support and love at home, but equally you can have somebody who's not technically disadvantaged, who has none of that support at home. So some children are very disadvantaged without them being on a list for disadvantage. And I think we have to recognise that too. So that autonomy of schools is very important.
Do you think online, so a lot of the evidence that we brought to bear on that white paper, and I think influenced the government on it, was face-to-face tutoring, right? And yet predominantly this has been an online affair, hasn't it? For all sorts of obvious reasons. I guess this is for all three of you, but I'll start with Vanessa and go the other way around. I mean, do we think that it is or can be as effective? And do you think it's a blended model for the future? So those two questions, and I'll start with Vanessa.
Well, I'm an advocate for online learning. That's what we do. That's what we've always done for 8 years, is online learning with great success. And we do that across the NTP now, 1 to 3, but we also do 1 to 12 students and anything in between with great success across all of those. I don't think there has been enough research into it, if I'm honest, because it's a relatively new thing. When we started 8 years ago, there was nowhere we could go, to be honest, to look at effective practice or what pedagogical methodologies work online. We've had to develop that on our own over experience and what we know. And also with that in mind, you have to also be able to scale that pedagogical structure, which has been a challenge, but I think we've got there. So I think we need more research, certainly, into online learning.
And just before I go on to Lucy on that, what about in school or outside school hours? Because again, my hope, I suppose, originally was this would be additional to the school day. And it's funny now we have lots of public debate about extending the school day, which is quite ironic, because originally we were thinking of tutoring being over and above the normal school day. Now, my understanding is it hasn't been that, right? That the first phase was within the school day. And then you get into discussions about what then do the children not do when they're doing that tutoring. You have any views on in or outside school timing for the NTP specifically?
It depends on the school, I think. Our traditional intervention method, students would be taken out of lessons. Schools have been more reluctant to do that now because of course, if you take them out of geography or another subject, they've already lost so much in that subject, they can't afford to lose more. So we've actually seen schools request 3, 4, 5 o'clock, even 6 o'clock in the evening. Within that, they have to choose the right students for that. Some won't log on at 6 o'clock if they're at home. So the way that we've seen it work best is an after school club where there is a session for students. So 3:15 till 4 o'clock, the tuition session. So they're in school, there's somebody with them, making sure that they're logging on and attending. That's been more successful than those who have been asked to access from home. But again, it depends on the students, and the schools know their students best. It's not just knowing the students within that disadvantaged group, it's knowing as well who will respond best to, as Sharon said earlier, there may be a blend of face-to-face or online, different tuition partners, etc. Trying to get as much of an individualised approach as possible. But then again, that causes a challenge, and the capacity within schools, it's very difficult to do that.
It's a pity, isn't it, Vanessa? Because I think my understanding, again, there will be less research on NTP going forward, because it would be wonderful to do studies about which time of the day it might be good to do. But you could do some quite interesting research around that. Anyway, I just want to come back to Lucy then, and then I'll go back to Sharon. So Lucy, in terms of just getting down to the details of what's your views on online versus face-to-face, and also in school and out of school?
Yeah, so I mean, to answer your question really bluntly, blended, definitely always blended. I think, as we look at the workplace at the moment, navigating this sort of new normal, you don't see everyone jumping back to face-to-face in the office, or definitely back to just getting rid of offices. We're going blended. Some people, it's better always, face-to-face. Sometimes it's better a mix. Sometimes people are better working from home. There's no one-size-fits-all model. This is education, I think in terms of one thing that's kind of struck me with the tutoring kind of industry and how we merge together, because I think that is important. Also, just to quickly answer about daytime face. I totally know what you mean. I think it's, again, that's up to the schools that know their pupils and know their situations. Again, there's not going to be one answer that just answers it and that can be the focus. I think for me, NTP phase 1 was quite limited, knowing, you know, it has to be 1-to-1 or 1-to-3, or it has to be 15 hours. I mean, to me, that kind of struck as who's made that decision.
That's the same for next year, Lucy.
Yeah, I know,
So
and that's
it's
disappointing.
not about it being phase 1. That's what the NTP is.
Yeah, I know. And I think that's really disappointing, because I think it just shows a really fixed mindset, to be honest with you. And I feel a little bit aggrieved that people are going to assume that that's the tutoring industry's opinion of what is best, as someone who's pretty outspoken about the kind of the tutoring industry merging seamlessly with educators. I feel sad that people are going to look at those numbers and go, okay, that's what the tutoring profession think is good for these learners, and that's not, quite frankly.
Sorry, it's 15 hours and what small group, what 1-to-3 is it? What are the exact
so it's
Sharon?
It's a 15-hour block. It's a single subject. You cannot repeat the child. So it's not about it being the best model. It's about managing budgets, and it's about managing provision. So this is in no way, I don't think, has any school ever thought that that has been the preferred model. I think what schools understand is they are buying a product, and the product they buy is 15 hours of tuition that can be delivered at any speed and at any progress. At Key Stage 3 and 4, you can only have a single subject. You can mix at primaries, and you cannot repeat the child in that same academic year. And they were just economic limitations, because otherwise you could literally have had a child being tutored at the expense of somebody else. So I don't really think that that was ever the intention of the perception to be carried forward. I think that was to package a service so that it could be sold.
And I do think it's I agree with you totally. I think it's disappointing that people think of it as a product, because tutoring is so much more than a product.
No, it's NTP, and we've got to be realistic. We have got budgets, we have got services to provide. This isn't intervention we're talking specifically here about a government-led intervention with a capped budget that you have to have some kind of business acumen to be able to deliver, because otherwise the whole system could have become completely and utterly chaotic. So there had to be that level of confines, and it is indeed a product at the end of the day.
I think it is, of course, but I think one of the things that I think for moving forward that would be a very good use of the funding, for example, and we're not thinking about the children here. I'm thinking more about, Lee, what you were saying about the head teachers who are in charge of making these decisions. I just haven't seen enough sort of involvement of those key decision makers in terms of us challenging as an industry, us challenging and supporting them in developing their understanding of how tutoring fits into their school. Because everyone has very preconceived ideas about the tutoring industry, dating back to like historical times kind of thing in terms of where it's come from. And I just think that would be something that'd be really useful, and I think would be very well received moving forward, and would also be very like easy to provide. One of the things that I'm working on at the moment, we do have a big announcement about sort of one of the provisions and projects that I've been working on that's coming out tomorrow in this space. And I just think it's about being a bit disruptive. The tutoring industry has been here for ages. We haven't just cropped up because of the NTP, and I think that we as tutors, we've been saying quite similar things for a long time. And clearly these misconceptions are still there. So we have to think about being creative in the way that we portray the benefits that we can provide our students. And I think it's just not about always going around in the same, because I feel like it's just a monotonous, we talk about the same thing, and disadvantaged pupils, how are we going to support them better? Let's actually do some stuff and get the people who are really keen to make and that goes back to the whole qualified teacher, not qualified teacher thing. If there's people who are passionate about making a difference, get them involved.
Sharon, just come back to one of the other issues, because we've got 10 minutes left. I want to come back to all three in terms of what you would do, what the main priorities are for phase 2. And also I want you to think about that sustainability question. How do we create, in my view, I hope that this does create a lasting legacy, that this is part of the education system in 10, 20 years time, etc. So I want you to think about that. But just before that, Sharon, you know, one of the tensions I think here, again, it might be down to transparency, communications on this. I think, and it's part of the political debates that the National Tutoring Programme sadly got caught up in, was the fact that it's seen as a commercial aspect. So you know, most schools, the culture is very much, we are a state educated school, and I don't want to over egg it, but I think there's probably a bit of suspicion around if someone comes in who's a private provider, and a lot of the negative media coverage really tapped into that sort of, you know, the privatization of education, etc., that sort of narrative. Do you think that is an issue? And because obviously there were social enterprises, there were charities, but there also, of course, there are.
And I think that's the first point I'd make. There was a mix of providers. So there were social enterprises, there were charities, and if a school wanted to go down that route, then obviously they could choose to do that. I also think there was a massive transparency with the pricing. You only had to go onto the NTP website and you could see everybody's markup and profit margin. So there was nothing hidden. And in a sense, I'm a bit of a mixture. I'm a bit of a dyed-in-the-wool socialist on the one hand, but I've privately educated my children. All right. I think it's okay to have choices. And I think to outsource after a national crisis like we've gone through with education is not necessarily an immoral thing to do. Okay. And if you look at what was going on there wasn't massive markups, because what wasn't seen very much by people outside of the NTP who weren't providers, they almost had this they have this innocent kind of overview. So a business just puts a tutor in a school. Oh my God, you have no idea the on costs of what came that far exceeded anything we were paid by the EEF. Fundamentally, we were given an Excel spreadsheet, and that was our operation system. We were given a pupil template. And from that, some businesses had to be so live in order to mobilize really quickly to work with such a breakneck speed to accommodate the level of reporting. The fortnightly reporting to the government in different forms, the data we've got coming out of our ears, and I'm sure Vanessa will completely and utterly understand where we've had to quickly take on more members of staff. In order to do what they've been asked to do, yes, you did need to outsource it, because you went to the people who had the mechanisms and the skill set and the capacity to do it. The NTP people, anybody who's thinking of going for the NTP this year, I'd love them to talk to some of the providers. It is so much more than just placing a tutor in a school. It is so much more than just talking to a head teacher. The massive amount of work that sits behind capturing that NTP, proving what goes on, is massive. And I think that's why it is important that they went to people with that skill set, because those people like my company that did have the skill set to deal with it were able to. Now, what is important this year about Randstad, you've talked about one of the reasons why they've won this bid. I think one of the main reasons they've won this bid is because they have a portal that is going to help us manage all of this stuff. So in the past, where we were given the back of an envelope to go and organise everything, practically literally, now Randstad are talking about an online booking system. They're talking about reporting from one single space. They're talking about streamlining all of our pain points from phase 1 into phase 2. They're opening it up to wider providers. And I think those who were probably less positioned last year to scale, to work with the demand, would be in a better position to apply this year, because I think there's going to be more support from the providers. I could probably come back and eat my own words now, and it'll be a complete and utter.
We'll review it again in a year's time, Sharon, see where you are with it.
Yeah, when I'm white. But I think we've learned a lot. It's been really, really hard, and a lot of people have sat there and not understood just exactly what companies have had to do to provide this level of tuition. But because we've seen as from the private sector and outsourcing and fat cats, I've got an office in Warrington with 4 women who've aged about 90 years since we started it. We're not all big conglomerates. We didn't all go to school with Boris Johnson and his mates. Some of us are actually just teachers who went ahead, put in a really good pitch and got it. Next year, I think we're going to see massive differences. There's going to be an even bigger series of providers. There's going to be a better mechanism for capturing data.
I'm just conscious of time here, so I want thanks, Sharon. I love your passion on this. Yeah, okay, Vanessa, coming back to you, because we've got 5 minutes now, I just want to finish off with 3 of you thinking about the long term, if we can. And I know we're thinking about the second phase, and we've learned a huge amount from the first phase, by the way. It was amazing, actually, what was accomplished, to be frank, in that time that we did. And I know there's all sorts of challenges, but I wonder, what you think about that sustainability question. Do you think phasing down the public money for this, because it could be argued, that we should have some public support for this as part of the education system? Do you think we will have a sustainable model at the moment?
I think it's possible, definitely. The government think that the tapering of the subsidy will make it sustainable, but then it's going from 75 this year, 70, 50, 10. So when you get to 10 in year 4, that's quite the drop. But if they move the funding into perhaps the pupil premium funding, then that makes it sustainable. There has to be funding, of course. And I think to make it sustainable as well, we have to have flexibility. We've discussed earlier the 15 hours, although it's probably operationally easier to do that. It doesn't work for everybody, particularly in alternative provision settings where students don't, they don't need 15 hours of tuition. We need the school, again, to have autonomy and what works best for that student. It could be 6 hours of learning in a group of 6 students, or it could be one-to-one for, an intense period of time. And I think as well, with the issue of capacity of tutors, we need to put more into tutoring and perhaps make it a recognised profession, making it accredited. I know you love that, Julia, but that's what we as a team want to do. It's not, as you say, Julia, a plan B. It's a genuine profession. So I'd like to see that. And I think the NTP is the way to go. Having different tuition partners has been good. And so the privatisation, I don't think, is an issue, because there are organisations like ours and Sharon's who are in it for the right reasons. And we have to keep that. I think it has to be a values-based thing. Those organisations have to have at the core the student. We always put the core of the students of everything we do. It's a compass for us in making the right decisions. And I think if somebody jumps on that for commercial benefits and sees this as a cash cow and an opportunity to make some money, then I think it's dangerous. So keeping it, I think, structured as the NTP with different organisations, because scaling nationally, it's not necessarily going to work. Schools with the way that it's structured now have the opportunity to choose a tuition partner who suit them best. An online tuition partner, a face-to-face, somebody locally, somebody not locally. So I think scaling the NTP as it is, with more funding, perhaps not through the subsidy, but maybe in pupil premium.
Okay. Lucy, what do you think then? Vanessa's quite optimistic about the current model. What do you think there is a future that we'll be here in 10 years' time talking about NTP?
So what I think the NTP has really done is provided a really great springboard for us joining school and tutoring together as educators. I think that has been brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and like a testament to, you, Lee, for like kind of coming up with the idea and then it being taken on. And I just think it's so important. But for me, I think there's a couple of things. My role is a lot of consultancy, and on one hand, I support very underprivileged children with like very large group webinars, which I did all through COVID, where I'm teaching up to 400 children creative writing at one time. And so scalability wise, that's super scalable. But obviously there'll be a lot of people who go, well, how can that be good quality? But what I think for me, I also do a lot of work with private family offices and investments and sort of that side of things. So for me, I kind of see sort of the future in terms of, I see what's happening with the government sort of initiatives, and I see what's happening from a sort of private investor side. And a lot of people are looking at the tapering down as the opportunity to taper up, investments and things like that. And I think we as educators have got to stop thinking about, obviously in terms of tutoring, we always have that sort of class divide of that tutoring's for the rich, and it's, it's causing like a gap, like Vanessa said. But I think that actually we need to see that as an opportunity. And I kind of consider what I do with my work as an example of how that can be beneficial to the underprivileged children, is that we need people out there speaking and shouting about, as we said, shouting from the rooftops, as Sharon said, you know, about what amazing work can happen, and then having those contacts with the right sort of investments, and not investments that we're going to sell our soul to venture capitalists and things like that, but, you know, just in terms of philanthropic people that are looking to really make a difference on the world. And we need to have those conversations, and we can't shy away from that, because, you know, having money means that we can have more impact. And if we view it like that, then that's a very powerful thing.
I'm going to have to stop you all there, Sharon. I'm afraid I've run out of time. I hope I gave you all enough time. You spoke all passionately. I'm really impressed with all you. I feel better than I did an hour ago in terms of the future of tutoring, I have to say. So thank you, everyone. I'm so pleased we wrote that paper 18 months ago, and you've given me more optimism from this session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lee, thank you so much for being here and listening and learning, because I know that I just introduced you to 3 amazing women. And I think the advantage of having high-level conversations like this is exactly like Lucy was saying just now. The reach is enormous, isn't it? So if we've inspired you and you take that forward in your next work, and we collaboratively are all making impact on the ground, then lots of students are going to benefit. And as we all agree, this is a values-based profession. So we're really glad to all be here together. Thank you so much. Ludo needs some lunch, so we're going to wrap up this session now. We're moving over to the Tutors Marketplace, and the second NTP roundtable will be happening at 2 o'clock. We have, Ludo, who do we have?
We have, of course, who'll be joining us. We have Tom Hooper from Third Space Learning. We have Scott Kelly from Teaching Personnel. And we have James Grant from My Tutor.
They are representing many thousands of tutors and many tens of thousands of students. We do hope that you'll join us. The first session was really, really informative and rich. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Sinjin. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Mandy. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Jolien. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Sid. Thanks, MJ. Thanks, Dror. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Sadia. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Karina. Where am I? Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Adele. Thanks, Elena. Thank you, Bethany. Thanks, Ina. Thanks, Ilana. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Will. And I don't know who it is from LearnCube, but thank you, LearnCube.